So linguistic anthropologist David Valentine's research on an imagined transgender community in New York in the late 1990s demonstrated that the distinction between sexuality and gender, upon which the transgender homosexuality divide is based, is conceptualized as ontological and cannot account for the complex differences between and reshapings of those analytic and lived domains, gender and sexuality. And like Valentine, I believe that the term transgender produces the category it claims only to describe. However, the focus of my talk today, unlike Valentine's, is not on the ways that the term transgender might not accurately represent the lived experiences of some racially and economically vulnerable members of the GLBT community, which is, of course, an important issue, but rather the ways that the discrete analytic divide between gender and sexuality, enacted through the transgender homosexual divide, marginalizes sexuality in trans lives. To be clear, I do not deny the usefulness or necessity of such a division analytically, but agree with Valentine that the question of the meaning of gender and sexuality is ultimately an ethnographic and historical one, rather than a purely theoretical one. Why should this concern us as researchers? If we take for granted this gender-sexuality divide, we cannot accurately represent the lived experiences of our transgender subjects whose lives are permeated by discourses of sexuality. They are over-sexualized, fetishized, and may be rejected either as hetero or homosexual due to stigmas or morphological differences that these discourses and categories do not easily accommodate. As Buckles and Hall note, gender and sexuality cannot be productively discussed independently of one another. So to focus solely on issues of gender with respect to transgender lives, as the recent research of Zim in 2012 has demonstrated, is to miss the complexity of the intersections between gender and sexuality. And as Cameron and Kulik state, sex, gender, and sexuality are not understood or experienced by most people in present-day social reality as distinct and separate. This is equally true of transgender individuals whose lives do not solely revolve around questions and issues of gender. So in an effort to more accurately represent some part of the social reality of transgender lives, I examined here the first 45 minutes of a conversation among transgender community leaders that took place at the Gay Church, a church with a predominantly GLB congregation in July of 2012. But before I continue with this analysis, I wanted to define some key terms that will help you better understand the discussion. Please keep in mind that these terms may be contested, and as such, I draw my definitions, where possible, from community members and the resources they've created for educating people about transgender lives. So if an individual identifies as transgender, they're someone who in some way crosses over or challenges traditional gender roles, expressions, or expectations. And in this community, we can refer to butch lesbians, effeminate men, transsexuals, cross-dressers, drag kings, intersex, agender, the list goes on. That doesn't mean they necessarily identify themselves that way, but they can be included if they self-identify. And on the opposite, we have someone who's cisgender, and that's an individual whose gender identity and gender expression usually match up with the sex that they were assigned at birth. Then we have the term transsexual. It's somebody who uses medical science to transform their bodies through the use of hormones, surgery, or the like, and somebody who's transsexual may be non-operative, taking only hormones, pre-operative, or post-operative. And then we have M to F and F to M, which represent male to female transsexual and female to male transsexual. And one further clarification needs to be made before I continue with the analysis. The title of this talk contains the word discourses, by which I mean sets of propositions in circulation about a particular phenomenon. Clearly, this is different than the linguistic definition of discourse, but I see discourses as being predicated on discourse. That is, discourses are, for the most part, dependent on language and use for their propagation and perpetuation, and may be viewed as intertextual, or perhaps more accurately, interdiscursive. This recording is part of a larger linguistic ethnography that has been ongoing since October of 2011 that studies the relationships between language and identity in female-to-male transsexuals, or F to Ms. The discussion analyzed here occurred at the beginning of a day-long workshop, and the workshop's goal was to educate the congregation about transgender issues. During the recorded segment analyzed in this talk, there were various rules and structures in place that required further explication. First, the room was arranged in a fishbowl. A number of chairs were arranged in a circle in the middle of the room where transgender community leaders were sitting facing each other. Surrounding them were listeners in another seated circle. Members of the outer circle were asked about their reasons for attending before the inner circle's discussion began, and each one of these congregation members who provided a reason also had to provide the group with their name, gender identity, sexual orientation, and preferred pronouns. And once the inner circle began their conversation, no comments were allowed from the outer circle. So the transgender community leaders inside the inner circle were provided with several prompts before their discussion started. What has been the most challenging or freeing aspects of your gender journey? How has your religion, faith, spirituality played a role in or been affected by your gender experience? What do you most want people to know about you? What would you most wish for in regards to gender in our world? And what question would you like to ask your fishbowl companions? But despite the overarching emphasis on gender in these prompts, the discussion that followed had more to do with sexuality than with gender. More specifically, the inner circle spent their time denaturalizing discourses of sexuality that did not fit their experiences, but nonetheless impacted their lives. The first discussant, Phyllis Fry, who asked that I keep her name in the discussion, all of their names are pseudonyms, oriented not to the provided prompts, but instead to the remarks on sexual orientation that the congregation as members of the outer circle had made. She said, I'm going to start because I heard some very interesting things when people were talking about sexual orientation. I believe a lot of people get confused about sexual orientation because our society has granted us the terms of heterosexual and homosexual and bisexual and asexual and others. It seems to me, and this is very obvious to the trans experience, that those labels mean nothing. So Phyllis immediately denaturalizes the categories. And for her, they are hopelessly inadequate attempts that cannot represent transsexualities and identities, and thus their problematic nature is exposed. Phyllis then uses her own experiences to explicate why she believes these categories to be flawed.
But the labels that we have are so
so that means heterosexual before, non-homosexual after. Now that is stupid. Until we can get society and the psychological community putting us into these heterosexual, homosexual boxes, that's not our orientation. We didn't wake up saying, oh, I'm heterosexual, I'm homosexual. No, we woke up saying, I'm attracted to guys, I'm attracted to gals, I'm attracted to equal opportunity to vote.
So Phyllis questions the naturalness of a definition of sexual orientation predicated on the bodily configurations and desires of both partners rather than just one. She then supplies an alternative method of categorization that more accurately represents her experience of attraction to women both before and after her transition. For Phyllis, sexual orientation is a subjective rather than intersubjective attraction that remains stable throughout the lifetime, not a one-size-fits-all category supplied by society, or more importantly, by the psychological community that refers simultaneously to both self and other. And a similar metalinguistic commentary on categories is taken up after another 5.5 minutes by Bobby. Bobby takes issue with the binary nature of sexual identity labels available to both transgender and cisgender individuals alike. His remarks clearly indicate what he feels to be a lacuna in discourses about transgender people. He tells the audience that he teaches human sexuality and spends an entire class period on just transsexuality, stating, trans people, yes, we have sexual orientation too. The transgender homosexual divide and the gender-sexuality divide on which it's predicated minimizes the intersections between gender and sexuality in transgender life, so much so that it is necessary for him to devote an entire class period to it. He then continues.
But the labels that we have are so dependent on your identity as well as the people or person that you're attracted to. And so the word lesbian, right, typically means that whoever's claiming that identity is supposed to identify as female and be only attracted to other people who identify as such or who they see as such. And so clearly, we even if you're not trans, know the limitations of those types of words that are very binary set up. You're a man or woman, or you're attracted to men or women. And there's like no other options.
So Bobby, like Phyllis, understands the intersubjectivity of available labels for sexual orientation, viewing them as too binary and limiting to reflect reality even outside the transgender community. His response to the limitations of the binary categorizations is to create his own identity label that accurately reflects his patterns of attraction as well as his socio-sexual life choices. He calls himself a lesbian man dyke, explaining that part of his sexual orientation is not just who he is attracted to. He sees his identity as a sexually oriented person as being about the community that he feels most comfortable with. And he says, I feel most comfortable with women who identify as lesbians, even though most people perceive me as a gay man. His label then, sometimes shortened to lesbian man dyke, sometimes extended to transgender queer lesbian man dyke, reflects components of a simultaneously gendered and sexual identity, reflected in the use of terms like man, gender queer dyke, lesbian. So more than just demonstrating the inadequacy of sexual identity labels, discussion group members moved on to criticize the fetishization and sexualization of trans bodies and lives, as well as their ideological relationship to homosexuality. And an important community leader directly addressed the over-sexualization of trans bodies and lives in discussing what she called the bathroom meme. So gender and queer theorist Jack Halberstam calls this the bathroom problem, and as he describes it, in public bathrooms for women, various bathroom users fail to measure up to expectations of femininity, and those of them who present in some ambiguous way are routinely questioned and challenged about their presence in the wrong bathroom. So by his account, M to Fs, as well as all gender ambiguous females, are scrutinized in the women's restroom. And while Halberstam's analysis places gender squarely in the center of the bathroom problem, public non-academic discourse justifies the exclusion of MTFs from restrooms and changing rooms, claiming that trans women pose a threat to cisgender women. And in this discourse, trans women are portrayed as hypersexual and deviant men who would go through all the trouble of a gender transition, or at least a feminine gender presentation, with all of the social consequences that entails just to achieve easier access to women. So Anne draws attention to these discourses in circulation that see trans people, and more specifically trans women, as hypersexual, sexually deviant, or simply as homosexual men suffering from internalized homophobia.
I would like to pick up on the nuance that you just touched on, the whole bathroom meme, the idea that trans women in women's restrooms pose perhaps a rape risk or something. Inherent in that belief is that trans women, trans men do this for sexual reasons. The point that I was trying to kind of touch on is whenever I started to transition, people assumed that I was a pedophile. They assumed that I was a rapist. They assumed all of these sexual, deviant, kind of assumptions about me. They kind of applied to me because of my trans status. And so that if I'm in a women's restroom, that's projected on me. If I'm in a dating situation, it goes from respectful interactions between two people to, very often.
Anne then goes on to describe how people have asked her repeatedly whether or not she transitioned so she could have boyfriends. And this reflects the discursively constructed ideological link between MTFs and homosexual men that remains, regardless of how often we hear that transgender is about gender and not sexuality. She reorients to this topic again after another community member, Raymond, mentioned a discussion he'd had about the fetishization of trans bodies in a trans sex workers workshop at the Philadelphia Trans Health Conference. Raymond drew attention to the fact that trans bodies, and again, especially trans women's bodies, are fetishized and become objectified in the process. So Anne's discussion of her experiences with these competing dominant discourses all position her as sexually deviant or hypersexual, or as a homophobic homosexual man. She continues on with her argument before stating that these sexual assumptions onto my identity, my experience, has impacted my life in such negative ways. And finally, we have Tom, an F2M, who then opened up another discussion of the ways in which the sexual discourses of cisgender individuals, whether they identify as hetero or homosexual, because of their exclusive focus on configurations of genitals, work to undermine trans identities. He then continues on to disclose that he himself was enmeshed in these ways of thinking and talking about sexuality, revealing negotiations he faced with his own as well as his partner's binary thinking about bodies.
When sometimes people like see us as the best of both worlds, or like they're a straight man or a trans woman, like you're saying, like, oh, well, I can experiment with that, but I don't have to be gay. It's because it's like when you talk about sexuality at the beginning, like what is sexuality? It's like it's not about genitals, like America is so hung up on genitals that they think, oh, like lesbians, like, oh, I would never touch a penis because that's always the part of what it's about, right? But it's like not, I can do that with myself and my partner. female, but when I was attracted to her, I was like, oh my gosh, what was me? Like, you know, so I had to take that off. And for her, you know, she was like, well, I can't. I couldn't finish because she thought she was a lesbian.
So rather than accepting the gender identities that trans people put forward, Tom remarks on how some cisgender people view transgender individuals as the best of both worlds. Even if that denies them their identity, they become a playground where people can experiment with homosexuality without being gay. And even Tom had his own difficulty accepting the gender identity of his partner when it came to sexuality. Tom, as a female to male transsexual, could not ask his partner to see him as a man if he did not see her pre-operative body as being a woman's. So what from the outside might look more like a heterosexual relationship is infused with negotiations and sociosexual life choices that both partners have made. As Woolen and Shiplin state in their discussion of language ideology, what people think or take for granted about language and communication is a topic that rewards investigation. Members of this discussion group highlight the shortcomings of labels and discourses that are inadequate to capture their social realities, including but not limited to the intersections of gender, sexuality, and corporeality, throwing ideologies that are a part of these discourses into sharp relief with their metalinguistic discourse. Motschenbacher's Language, Gender, and Sexual Identity we are given an introduction to queer linguistics. We are told that its subject matter is the linguistic construction of heteronormativity and its stabilizing mechanisms, normative gender binarism, and that a long-term goal of this approach is the reconceptualization of dominant discourses which shape gender and sexual identities. It is with these tenets in mind that I labeled the discussion under analysis queer and moved to position the interlocutors as queer linguists themselves, inasmuch as their metalinguistic commentary views dominant discourses and categories that perpetuate heteronormativity as well as gender binarism as flawed. The bodies and lives reflected in this discussion complicate our understandings of what it means to be transgender. And in many ways, transgender lives have done for gender studies in all its interdisciplinary manifestations what African American English once did for sociolinguistics. It has been, as John Rickford once said of the American quantitative sociolinguistic enterprise and the African American speech community, an unequal partnership. Scholars like Harold Garfinkel or Judith Butler look to the transgender community to make claims about the production and performance of gender in society at large. But trans woman Julia Serrano criticizes academics for what she believes to be an inaccurate representation of the subjective experience of trans lives, used solely to prop up academic theories. She writes, cis-sexual academics eagerly cite aspects of gender-variant lives that support their claims that gender is primarily constructed, while ignoring those aspects that undermine their cases. It is for this reason that I advocate an ethnographic approach to studying transgender lives. While it certainly falls on the lesser spectrum of contributions and service that could be made to the community, it does not do transgender individuals the disservice of seeing them as singularly involved in gender performativity and allows us to better understand their socio-sexual life choices. Simultaneously, I think positioning the participants in this discussion as queer linguists, by virtue of their metalinguistic discussion that disrupted binary representations of sexuality and heteronormative discourses, as another method for creating a more equal partnership. Recognizing that their analyses of their social reality are of as much value as my initial interest at the outset of my project in language and gendered identities in the lifespan. Thank you.